first started raising chickens, I was really confused about what kind of bedding I should be giving them in their coop. And one of the reasons I was so confused is because I kept finding these two different schools of thought, where there was this one school of thought that would say, sand, you've got to use sand. Sand is the best thing out there. And straw is really, really horrible. Don't ever use straw. And then I was getting the opposite, where it was saying straw is really, really good. You got to use straw, and you can't use sand. If you use sand, you're a horrible person. All your chicks are going to die. And the people on this other side were saying that same thing about straw. Just, oh, you're horrible if you use straw. Everybody's going to die. And so I was thinking, what is going on here? And so I did a lot of research, and I mean a lot of research on all different bedding types. And I went to the academic journals for this because the blogs, everybody was saying conflicting things and it didn't seem reliable. And so if you have ever been to my blog and read any of my posts on bedding, or at least most of them, you will see that they are very heavily researched with dozens and dozens of citations. And I'm going to tell you a little juicy story here, although I'm going to leave the names out. But I wrote this blog post a long time ago now on the pros and cons of sand bedding. And it's more of a practical blog post than anything, but it does link to my more scientific one on the research on sand. But it was a practical blog post, and I started it out with this problem that I started at the beginning of this video, where it's just like using sand is just the most wonderful thing in the world, or it's the biggest nightmare. And just how crazy it is that you have these two opposite extremes. And then I went into what research and practical experience have taught me about sand and how you can use it. And then I got contacted by someone. This person is someone who is very, very, very popular in the online chicken space, and she is incredible. I love her stuff. I learned a lot from her when I was first getting started with chicks. She sends me this email. She asks if she can talk to me. So I sent her back my phone number, and she called me on the phone, and she tells me these terrible stories about how all these different bloggers and other online people in the chicken space are in these feuds with each other, and there are all these lawsuits and all these different things. And so I learned that when it comes down to this big debate between sand and straw, that it was actually a debate kind of between two teams rather than really based on anything real. And so there was one team who supported the person who uses straw in her coop, and there was another team, and when I'm saying team, I just mean audiences, followers. There's this other team that supported the person who used sand in her coop. And that a lot of these really, really angry comments back and forth really just had this kind of politics behind them of being on this team and against that person, or vice versa. And that's why she told me this is why I'm seeing this big kind of polarization on whether sand is horrible or wonderful and whether straw is horrible and wonderful. And so I wanted to just kind of tell you guys about that, so that if you start reading things about bedding or even about other topics in backyard chicken raising, that you need to understand that there's been some really, really ugly stuff going on behind the scenes. And a lot of the stuff that's being said is political or, personality driven. It's feudal rather than actually just trying to get things right for what's best for chickens. And I think these people who are doing this, I don't think they're consciously giving out misinformation. I think they probably believe everything that they are saying, but I don't think they realize that bias is driving them. And I wanted to give you this little introduction because I did get an email from one of my audience members, Susan, who asked me to do a video on an article that she had read that gave a bunch of cons about using sand. And so this article, she says, comes from Hobby Farm / Chicken Magazine. I will link to the article below. It wasn't actually an article just about sand. It talked about a bunch of different bedding types, but I did read the section on sand. And I have to say that the person who wrote it, I do feel like they tried to be unbiased It sounds like a person who's never used sand. It sounds like a person who read a bunch of blog posts from everybody else about sand and then tried their best to write about it in an unbiased way. But because everything's conflicting, it is very hard to get this correct. And before I jump into this, I do just want you to know that I have used sand in my coop. Sand is my favorite. I use it in my coops and run, but I have used straw. I have used other organic bedding types, and I'm not against straw. I think that done correctly, straw can be a very great bedding type, but I did want you to know that not only do I have a research background in this, that I read every single paper I could find, every academic paper I could find on bedding, but I also do have a lot of practical experience. All right, so I've got the cons of the article printed out in front of me, and the first one here for a con is that sand doesn't compost. I don't really think we can argue with that. If you want bedding that composts well, then you will need to go with an organic type. And then the second con says minimal odor control, and then they put in parentheses, says the no sand group. And I will say that when I looked at their pros, they used the opposite, where they said odor was very low, and then in parentheses they put the opposite, say the pro sand group. So what is the truth on that? The truth on that is that odor is very, very low in sand compared to organic beddings. And this makes perfect sense if you think about it, because sand is very, very dry. And so when you get any kind of moisture from poop or whatever in your sand, it dries it out very quickly. And this is actually my favorite property of sand, is that the poop dries out very quickly. And because it dries out very quickly, you don't get all the odors from it that you get when you're using organic bedding, because the poop does not dry quickly in organic bedding. And not only does poop not dry quickly in organic bedding, the nutrients and the moisture and whatever else in that poop is going to cause that organic bedding to start breaking down. And there can be a lot of different gases and odors released as bacteria and things break this bedding down. So that con is false. The sand is not stinkier. It is quite the opposite. And it's not just a little bit different. The smells are drastically reduced when you use sand bedding. And then the third con here says that sand can clump and compact in the crop when ingested. And that's both true and not true. So a couple of things there. The first thing is that this can be, based on anecdotes, this can be a problem with play sand. So if you use play sand that's very fine grained, it tends to be 100% quartz. And when you get that kind of sand moist, it does compact. If you think of, making sand castles and things with beach sand, not that beach sand and play sand are identical, but beach sand also is very fine grained. It has a lot of quartz in it, and that stuff compacts really well. So if your chickens were to eat a lot of that play sand and then they drink water, you could get that kind of compacted in there, but they would have to eat a certain amount of that sand. And so you have to ask yourself, why are they eating that sand? And that can happen. The chickens will always eat a little bit of their bedding, no matter what type of bedding you use. That's just something that's kind of come up in studies, is that they will just consume a little bit of it, but they shouldn't be eating a lot of it. There have been cases where chickens do eat a lot of bedding. There's pica, if you guys have heard of that, where people can have pica, where they eat things that aren't appropriate to eat. I remember years ago, I watched the show Grimm, and there was an episode where the guy, he unzipped or cut open his couch cushion and he started eating the stuffing inside.
Open up the door, man. I can't right now. I'm in the middle of dinner. What are you eating? Fiber.
And that's pica. And there are studies that have shown that chickens can get pica when they're really stressed out. And so in one that I remember particularly, they had moved laying hens to a new location, and it was a much nicer area for them. It should have been a much better quality of life. There was a lot more space, but that move just in that new environment really stressed them out. And some of these hens just ate a ton of, I don't remember if it was straw or shavings, but it was some kind of organic bedding. And they got their crops impacted, and some of them had stuff impacted further down, and some of them died. But of course, that's not the norm. This is not what our chickens should be doing. And so I do say that you shouldn't be using play sand, even simply because it's so fine grained, and that chickens can get they can actually get a disease called silicosis by inhaling those fine grains. So stay away from those fine grain sands. I'll get a little more into that here in a bit. But yeah, there is that risk of crop impaction. It's not guaranteed to happen. There are lots of people who have used play sand and they've had no problem with crop impaction. But the more your sand is able to compact when it gets wet, the higher that risk is going to be. So the sand that I use is a medium to coarse grained sand. It has different minerals in it, so it's not just pure quartz. And it's a natural sand. It came from a quarry somewhere. Because of that kind of differences in composition and the texture, the crystalline structure of the grains in this sand, with many of the grains being larger, you can't make sand castles out of them. They're not that type of sand. And so that risk of crop impaction is lower. And actually one of the things I love about using this kind of sand is that the chickens can eat it for grit, and they will eat it for grit. So you don't have to give them an extra grit source. It's right there. And could they get crop impaction with this kind of sand? Yeah, if they ate a ton of it, but that's true of any bedding type, no matter what you use. Then the next con, and this one is always this makes me laugh. It says minimal temperature regulation. And it says hot sand in the summer can burn chicken feet. Cold sand in the winter can cause frostbite. And the reason that one makes me smile is because when you look at the academic research, sand in the summer is actually much, much cooler, and it actually cools your coop down. And it's wonderful when you go in there in the sand. They can kind of dig down a little bit, and it's cool to the touch. And so no, it's not going to burn your chicken's feet unless you have it exposed to direct sunlight. Because sure, if you walk across a beach that's had sun shining on it, that could hurt your feet. That's going to be true with sand. But when the sand is on your coop floor, unless you just have a coop that's totally open and has sun just shining down onto that sand, then the sand will actually be cooler and make that coop a little bit cooler than it would be if you were using organic bedding. This is also why sometimes in the summer I will put sand in my chickens' nesting boxes. And I just do that because it helps cool the hens down just that little bit. And so I don't use it year round because the hens prefer organic material in their nesting boxes. I like to use aspen pads for them. It is fine to use sand year round, but I do like to put it in there when the temperature gets really, really high, because it does just help them out a little bit while they're panting in the nesting box. So that is false, what this person has here. And then that second bit, they say cold sand in winter can cause frostbite. So the thing is that just as sand is cooler in the summer, it can be cooler in the winter too, especially if you're going to compare it to the deep litter method with organic bedding, because that does release a little bit of heat. And the sand can be very cold, but it should not be giving your chickens frostbite. We need to think through that one for a minute. So first of all, are your chickens standing in the sand even? Because in the winter, my chickens don't just hang out in the sand. They're usually perching on things, or they're actively scratching around in the sand. And I've never ever even once had a chicken get frostbite on their feet. I also have my coop set up so I have sweeter heaters hanging over the roosting bars. When my chickens get cold, they will just come and jump on the roosting bars and warm up under the sweeter heater. But there is no reason why sand should be giving your chickens frostbite, unless that sand has gotten wet and it's frozen and your chickens are standing on it, and then yes, they can get frostbite. And I actually had someone email me one time where their chickens got frostbite. They were brand new to chickens and they had moved them out into their coop and run, and they lived in Colorado, and unexpected weather came through very, very early in the fall season. So it had been warm, and then this blizzard just hit, and they did not have their run set up for that blizzard. And so they came home from work and all the chickens were in the coop doing fine. Nobody in the coop had frostbite. They were good. But they said they had this one rooster and they had an elevated coop, and this rooster was standing underneath it, and they had sand in their run. So he was standing on this wet sand with snow blowing on him because the run was totally exposed. They didn't have any kind of plastic blocking it off or anything. And so he was just standing on this frozen ground, and he ended up getting frostbite on his feet. There was a very good reason for that, and that shouldn't be happening in your coop. And the people who emailed me this story, they said they just didn't know what to do to prevent that. Should they be throwing straw down in their run? And I asked them, do you have anything? I mean, first of all, when you're getting weather like that, you need to protect the run from snow and rain, and put a roof on it if you have that kind of weather. Put plastic around the sides when it gets into winter. But also I asked them, do you have anything in your run for them to get up on? And they didn't. So they had no perches and no benches or anything like that. All they had was the ground. I think that rooster he had never experienced weather, and so he probably just felt slightly sheltered underneath the coop, and he would have been better off getting in the coop, but that was his reaction. And a lot of roosters, I have a lot of roosters stay out in really bad weather no matter what. I think it's this instinct. They want to keep an eye on everything to keep the hens safe, so that might have been going on with him. But again, why would that happen in your coop? The sand in your coop should never be frozen. It should never get wet. And so one of the things I tell people is that if they live in a place with moisture and the temperature drops below freezing, then I do not recommend at all that you use sand on just a coop with no floor. So if the sand's right against the ground, you need to be really careful with that. Or if you do use sand right against the ground, you need to have a really, really thick layer of sand. But the problem with having it right against the ground like that is that moisture can come up into your bedding. And so if you lived in a place with a lot of moisture, then you could maybe get some moisture in your sand and have it freezing. But for most of us, that just isn't an issue. And if you have a floor on your coop, that's not going to be an issue at all. So that also is a false con. And then this last one, they say a con is that sand can breed bacteria and pathogens. And that also is just really, really false. And again, I think this person was trying their best, just probably reading other blog posts to see what people are saying. And I do see anti-sand people making this claim all the time, which is bizarre because, and I'm gonna link to my research on sand below so you can kind of look at this for yourselves. But in studies over and over and over again, bacteria and pathogen load are significantly lower in sand than in straw, than in pine shavings, than in any other type of bedding. So that's false. You actually have much less growth of pathogens. And again, this should make sense to you for a couple of reasons. First of all, the sand immediately dries poop, and so that moisture is gone, and it's very hard for things like bacteria or molds to grow without that moisture. So that's one thing, that dryness of sand. And then the second thing is that sand is inorganic, so it's not providing nutrients for these things to grow. So when you have straw or pine shavings or these organic beddings that bacteria can nibble on and decompose, and I don't really know the logistics of how all that happens, but that organic content really helps those pathogens to thrive, and sand just doesn't have that. So that is another false con. And if you're wondering, well, why do people keep making that claim? Well, some of them will actually they'll claim that research says this, and then they'll either, a lot of them just don't provide any citation at all, but some of them will link to an abstract or give the name of a paper. And I have looked up every single one of them, and they're always linking to studies that have nothing to do with the type of sand that is used in a chicken coop. So there was one that talked about beach sand that had, tides going in and out. So for part of the day or part of the night, the sand was covered in water. And so, yeah, it has stuff growing in it. If you have sand in water like that, you're gonna have, and it's covered in algae. It was ridiculous to think that people would put that in their coops. There was another one on stagnant water near one of the Great Lakes. So it's kind of the swampy, stagnant lake or pond, and people took sand from there, and it had nothing to do with chicken coops. They were just studying the ecology or whatever, but they found all these different, I think they found E. coli and I don't know what else in there. But yes, you do not want to go to some swamp that's got stagnant water and things growing in it and then use that sand in your coop. That is not, it's like apples to oranges kind of things. That has nothing to do with chicken coop sand, which tends to come from rock that you crush. So it hasn't had exposure to a lot of moisture. Or sometimes you can get riverbank sand, which has, it's maybe had some fresh water going over it. And then the sand goes through this big washing and sieving process, but you just don't get those kind of organisms that you get from stagnant water. And that's why if you look at any of the sands in actual research that's been done on sand bedding for poultry, the pathogen growth is significantly lower than everything else. And then lastly, this person ends by saying, as little as 1/4 inch of sand on the coop floor may be sufficient for comfort and cleanliness. And 1/4 inch of sand is not enough. I would say you need at least 2 inches, especially if you had a wood floor. Just 1/4 inch of sand doesn't really cushion that much. And what they do, one scratch on it and you'd have your bare floor. So I think we, in my coops, I usually go anywhere from 2 to 4 inches and sometimes up to 6 inches even. They don't really need 6 inches, but it's kind of nice to just have that much sand in your coop. But they are wrong. 1/4 inch of sand is not enough. And then they say, but it's important to note that predators can burrow into the coop through sand floors if no other materials are used. That's true of every single type of bedding. Predators can burrow through it if no other, if there's no hard floor under it or there's no wire. And then the very last thing they say, additionally, sand can freeze in the winter, losing all of its cushioning abilities. And we went over that. Your sand should not be freezing. You should not have that moisture in your sand. So that too is false. One of the craziest things about these cons in this article is that they left out the one thing about sand that I do think is a huge, huge con. So the one thing that you should be worried about, they didn't put in this article, and then they put in all these other things that are just factually incorrect. And so that one thing is the concern for silicosis and silicate pneumoconiosis in your chickens. And if you guys have ever read my blog post on bedding, I have said this so much that I feel like it should be my motto, and that is, there is no such thing as a perfect chicken bedding. So every single type of bedding that's used has potential problems associated with it. I think from all the research that sand is the best option out of a bunch of not so great options. So I don't want to sit here and pretend that sand could never do anything bad to your chickens. I do worry about the lung scarring and lung disease from inhaling those fine grains that are either, you always hear the word silica, which is just the fancy word for plain old quartz, but also other silicate minerals. And silicate minerals are very, very, very common. So most of the minerals you see in rocks are silicate minerals. And I do talk about this topic a bit more in a video I did where I answered 5 questions people had sent me on sand. And basically you want to choose a medium to coarse grained sand that's not 100% quartz if you can help it. If you want to learn more about this and other things about sand, then check out my video right here to learn more.